I honestly don't even know where to start with this. It's been eating me alive for weeks, and I can't talk to anyone about it. I've thought about posting here before, but I never had something big enough to share, until now. It's going to be a long one, and I might ramble a bit, so bear with me. I just really need to get this off my chest. So, some background. I'm 26, and my brother, let's call him Dan, is 24. We've always been close, or at least I thought we were. We grew up in a pretty typical suburban family. Mom, dad, 2 kids, a dog. You get the picture. Our parents were strict, but not in a crazy way. They had high expectations, but we weren't beaten or anything. If anything, Dan was always the golden child. He got straight A's without trying, had tons of friends, and was basically the poster child for good kid. Meanwhile, I struggled with school and had to work twice as hard for half the praise. But I always chalked it up to the usual older sibling versus younger sibling dynamics. You know how that goes. Anyway, fast forward to a few weeks ago. I had just gotten back from work, exhausted, and Dan calls me up out of nowhere. He never calls me just to chat, so I immediately knew something was up. I could hear it in his voice. He was nervous. He asked if I could come over, said there was something we needed to talk about. He lives about 20 minutes away, so I didn't think much of it and drove over. When I got there, I could tell something was off. Dan was pacing around his apartment, barely able to look me in the eye. I thought maybe he'd gotten into trouble or something. Maybe he lost his job, or worse. I didn't know what to expect, but what he told me hit me like a ton of bricks. He said, "I'm going to tell you something, but you have to promise you won't freak out." Of course, that's the best way to get someone to freak out, right? So I was already on edge. He sat down and told me this long, convoluted story about how our parents aren't really our parents. Or at least, they're not my parents. Yeah. Apparently I'm adopted, and no one ever bothered to tell me. I wish I could say I handled it well, but I didn't. I kind of just sat there in stunned silence, trying to process it. Dan said he found out a few months ago when he overheard our parents talking. He wasn't supposed to know either, but once he did, he couldn't hold it in anymore. He said he didn't want to keep the secret from me, even though our parents told him not to say anything. I don't even know how to explain how I felt in that moment. It was like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, was suddenly a lie. I didn't say anything to Dan for what felt like an eternity. My mind was racing. Who were my real parents? Did they abandon me? Why did my adoptive parents never tell me? Was I not supposed to find out? Dan kept apologizing, saying he didn't mean to hurt me, but I could barely hear him. I couldn't focus on anything except this massive revelation. Finally, I just got up and left. I didn't even say goodbye. I drove home in a daze, trying to keep it together, but I couldn't stop shaking. I know it sounds dramatic, but it felt like my whole identity had been shattered in an instant. Who am I, if not their child? I got home, sat in my car for what must have been half an hour, and just stared at the steering wheel. I don't even know what I was waiting for. Maybe some epiphany? Maybe for the whole thing to feel less real? But it didn't. I didn't know what to do, so I went inside and did something dumb. I called my mom. I know that probably seems insane considering what I just learned, but I guess part of me still needed her, needed something normal. We just talked about random stuff, what she made for dinner, how her day went. The entire time I was thinking, is she even my mom? Does she know I know? It took everything in me not to just blurt it out, but I didn't. I didn't want to deal with that yet. After I hung up, I went to bed, but I didn't sleep. I just laid there staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction I've ever had with my parents. Did they ever treat me differently? Did they ever hint at this? I couldn't think of anything obvious, but maybe I just missed the signs. I wanted to scream, but it felt pointless. What good would it do? The next few days were a blur. I went to work, talked to friends, acted like everything was fine, but inside I was falling apart. I thought about confronting my parents, but the idea of that conversation made me nauseous. What would I even say? "Hey, so I know you've been lying to me my entire life. Care to explain?" Eventually, Dan called to check on me. I think he was hoping I'd gotten over it, but I hadn't, not even close. I told him I wasn't ready to talk yet, and he understood. Still, it didn't make anything easier. I mean, what do you do when your whole life feels like a lie? I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that my real parents were out there somewhere, and I didn't know anything about them. Did they even want me? Why didn't they raise me? Finally, after about a week of driving myself insane, I made the decision to confront my parents. I knew I couldn't move forward without answers. So one night after work, I went over to their house. I was shaking the entire drive, and by the time I pulled into their driveway, I was seriously considering turning around and pretending like none of this ever happened. But I couldn't do that, could I? I had to know. I walked in, and everything was normal. Mom was cooking dinner, Dad was watching TV. It felt so surreal, like any other day, but everything was different now. I don't even remember how I started the conversation. I think I just blurted it out, something like, "Dan told me." My mom froze. She turned off the stove and just stood there, not saying a word. My dad muted the TV and looked at me confused. "What did Dan tell you?" he asked, but he already knew. I could see it in his eyes. I told them everything Dan had said, and it was like the floodgates opened. My mom started crying immediately, saying she was sorry, that they had always planned to tell me, but they never knew when the right time was. My dad, on the other hand, just sat there, quiet. He didn't say a word the entire time. I felt like I was watching someone else's life, like I was detached from the whole situation. My mom kept apologizing, but it wasn't making anything better. I wanted answers, not apologies. I asked them about my real parents, and my mom just shook her head, saying she didn't know much. They had adopted me when I was a baby through some agency, and my birth parents had requested to stay anonymous. They didn't even have names for me, just some basic information. My birth mother was young, barely out of high school, and my birth father was never in the picture. That was it. That was all they knew. I don't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't that. I guess part of me had hoped for more, like maybe my real parents had been searching for me all these years or something. But no, they were just a couple of strangers who gave me up and moved on with their lives. I should have felt grateful that my adoptive parents had taken me in, raised me, loved me. But in that moment, all I felt was anger. Anger at them for lying to me, anger at my real parents for abandoning me, and anger at myself for not knowing sooner. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I think I left pretty quickly. I couldn't be in that house anymore, not after everything I'd just learned. It felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I drove around aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of everything, but there was no making sense of it. My entire life, the foundation of everything I knew, was built on a lie. I didn't talk to my parents for a few days after that. I needed space. I needed time to process. Dan kept texting me, asking if I was okay, but I didn't know how to respond. Was I okay? I didn't feel okay. I felt like a stranger in my own life. I kept replaying every memory I had of my childhood, looking for clues, trying to figure out if there had been signs that I'd missed, but nothing stood out. My parents had treated me like their own. They'd loved me, taken care of me, supported me. And yet, they'd kept this huge secret from me for 26 years. Eventually, I called Dan. I wasn't mad at him. I knew he was just trying to do the right thing. But I needed to talk. I needed to get it all out. So we met up at a coffee shop, and I just unloaded everything. I told him how angry I was, how betrayed I felt, how I didn't know who I was anymore. He listened, didn't interrupt, didn't try to offer advice. He just let me vent, which was exactly what I needed. After I was done, Dan finally spoke. He told me that he understood why I was upset, but he also said something that really stuck with me. Our parents may have lied to you, but they still raised you. They're still your family. I didn't want to hear it at the time, but deep down, I knew he was right. My parents might not be my biological family, but they were the ones who had been there for me every step of the way. They were the ones who had taken me in, loved me, and given me a good life. But that didn't erase the hurt. It didn't make the betrayal any less painful. I went back and forth for weeks, trying to decide what to do. Should I confront my parents again? Should I try to find my real parents? Should I just move on and pretend like none of this ever happened? There were no easy answers, and I felt like I was drowning in uncertainty. One night, after another sleepless night of tossing and turning, I made a decision. I was going to try to find my birth parents. I don't even know why. Maybe I just needed closure. Maybe I needed to know where I came from. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to at least try. I didn't tell anyone about my decision, not even Dan. I wasn't sure how he'd react, and I didn't want to deal with anyone else's opinions. This was something I had to do for myself. So I started researching. I looked up the adoption agency my parents had used, but it had closed down years ago. That was a dead end. I tried looking through old records, but I kept hitting roadblocks. It felt like every door I tried to open was slammed in my face. For a while, I thought about hiring a private investigator, but I didn't have the money for that. So I kept searching on my own, obsessively scrolling through online forums and adoption registries, hoping to find some kind of lead. But weeks went by, and I found nothing. I was getting more and more frustrated, but I couldn't give up. I couldn't let it go. Then, one night, I got a message on Facebook. It was from someone I didn't recognize, but the name sounded familiar. It took me a second to realize why. It was the name of my birth mother. At least that's what the message said. "Hi, I'm not sure if you'll read this or if you're even the person I think you are, but I've been looking for my son. I'm not sure if this is the right account, but if your birth date is, insert my birth date, then I think we need to talk." I couldn't believe it. After all the searching, all the dead ends, my birth mother had found me. My hands were shaking as I stared at the message, not knowing what to do. Do I respond? Do I ignore it? A part of me had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, I felt paralyzed. What if she didn't want a relationship? What if she just wanted to explain why she gave me up and then disappear again? I took a deep breath and responded, keeping it simple. "Hi, I think you might be right. I've been trying to find you too." I didn't expect an immediate response, but within minutes, my phone buzzed again. "Oh my God! I can't believe I found you! I've been waiting for this for so long!" I stared at the screen, my heart racing. I had so many questions, but I didn't know where to start. I typed and deleted several responses before finally settling on something simple. "I don't know what to say. This is a lot." She replied quickly. "I know. I don't want to overwhelm you. We can go at your pace. I just want to know that you're okay." Okay? I didn't even know what that meant anymore. I was sitting in my apartment reading messages from the woman who gave birth to me, and I was supposed to know how to respond? Part of me wanted to scream at her, ask her why she gave me up, why she never came looking for me sooner. Another part of me wanted to thank her for giving me a life with parents who loved me. I felt so conflicted I didn't know what to feel. After a few minutes of staring at her message, I finally responded, "I don't even know where to start. Why now? Why didn't you try to find me earlier?" I hit send before I could second-guess myself. It felt good to get that out, but also terrifying. I didn't know how she would react. I watched the little typing indicator pop up, then disappear, then pop up again. Finally, her response came through. "I wanted to, I did, but I didn't know if you wanted to be found. When I gave you up, I didn't have a choice. I was so young, and I didn't have the means to take care of you. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But I always hoped you were with a family who loved you. I didn't want to interfere in your life unless you were looking for me too." I felt a lump form in my throat as I read her message. It wasn't the answer I expected, but it made sense. I couldn't imagine how hard it must have been for her to give up her child, to wonder if I was okay, to not know what kind of life I was living. Still, it didn't make the hurt go away. I typed back, "They did love me, but I wish you had told me sooner." Her response came almost immediately. I'm sorry. I really am. If I had known you wanted to find me, I would have reached out sooner. I don't want to make excuses, but I was scared. Scared you'd hate me. Hate her? I wasn't sure what I felt. There was a part of me that was angry, sure. But did I really hate her? No, I couldn't say that. How could I hate someone I didn't even know? I don't hate you, I typed. I just don't know how to feel right now. She didn't respond for a while, and I started to feel anxious, wondering if I'd said the wrong thing. But after what felt like an eternity, she finally messaged back. That's okay. You don't have to figure it all out right now. We can take this slow. I just want to know you're okay, and maybe, if you're open to it, we can get to know each other. But only if you're ready. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling a breath I didn't realize I was holding. She wasn't pushing me. She wasn't trying to force a relationship. She was giving me the space to decide what I wanted. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I felt a tiny bit of relief. This was something I could control. I didn't have to rush into anything. I think I want that, I replied, but I'm going to need some time. Her reply was simple. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. After that, we exchanged a few more messages, mostly just small talk. It was weird, trying to have a normal conversation with someone who I was technically related to but knew nothing about. She told me a little about her life. She lived in a small town, worked as a nurse, had no other kids. I told her about my job, my brother, and how close we'd been growing up. But there was an underlying awkwardness to it all. We were trying to connect, but there was still so much left unsaid. Over the next few weeks, we messaged back and forth occasionally. I was still processing everything, but I appreciated that she wasn't pressuring me to meet in person or dive into heavy topics. It was a slow, tentative process, and that was exactly what I needed. Meanwhile, I still hadn't told my adoptive parents about any of this. I knew I had to eventually, but I wasn't ready. I didn't know how they'd react. Would they feel threatened? Hurt? Would they even care? The idea of that conversation made my stomach turn, so I kept putting it off. But of course, nothing stays hidden forever. One weekend, while I was visiting my parents for dinner, my mom brought it up out of nowhere. We were sitting at the kitchen table eating spaghetti when she said, "Have you thought about looking for your birth parents?" I nearly choked on my food when she asked. My heart started pounding and I could feel my face turning red. How did she know? Was it that obvious? I tried to play it cool. Yeah, I've thought about it a little. Why? She put her fork down and looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Half worried, half something else. Your father and I were talking the other night and we just wanted to know how you're feeling. We know this has been a lot for you. I could feel the tension in the air. My dad, who had been quietly eating, looked up from his plate, waiting for me to respond. I felt like I was cornered, and there was no way to avoid the conversation anymore. I actually found her, I blurted out. I hadn't planned on saying that, but there it was, out in the open. My mom's eyes widened, and my dad set his fork down, clearly surprised. For a moment, no one said anything. Then my mom spoke, her voice soft. You found her? I nodded. Yeah, she found me actually. She sent me a message on Facebook. They exchanged a glance, and I could see the concern in their eyes. My dad cleared his throat. And have you talked to her? Yeah, I admitted. We've been messaging a little. She's not pushing me or anything, but she wants to get to know me. I haven't decided what I want to do yet. The room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. I could see the emotions playing across my mom's face. Relief, maybe, but also sadness. Finally, she spoke. I'm glad you've been able to connect with her. I know this isn't easy, and I'm sorry we didn't tell you sooner. We never wanted to hurt you. I could hear the sincerity in her voice, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I felt a little bit of the anger I'd been carrying start to fade. They hadn't handled everything perfectly, but I knew they loved me, and they were trying. I know, I said quietly. I don't blame you. I'm just trying to figure all of this out. My dad, who had been mostly silent, finally spoke up. We'll support you, no matter what you decide to do. You'll always be our son. I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything else. There was too much emotion swirling inside me to even begin to unpack it all. So I just sat there, letting their words sink in. After that, dinner continued in relative silence. We didn't talk much more about my birth mother, and I was grateful for that. I wasn't ready to have a full-blown discussion about it, and I think they sensed that. But at least the secret was out now. I didn't have to keep it hidden anymore. Over the next few weeks, things started to feel a little more normal. I continued messaging my birth mother, slowly getting to know her bit by bit. She told me about her family, how she had been terrified when she found out she was pregnant, how she had struggled with the decision to give me up. It was hard to read at times, but it also gave me a new perspective. She wasn't just some faceless woman who had given me up. She was a person with her own story, her own struggles. And I was part of that story. At the same time, my relationship with my adoptive parents started to feel less strained. I was still working through my feelings about the whole situation, but I was beginning to see things more clearly. They had made mistakes, but they had also given me a life filled with love and support. And that wasn't something I could just dismiss. Eventually, the day came when my birth mother asked if I wanted to meet in person. I knew it was coming, but I still wasn't sure how I felt about it. Part of me was curious, wanted to see her face, hear her voice. But another part of me was scared. Scared of what meeting her would mean. Scared that it might change things with my adoptive parents. Scared that I wouldn't feel anything at all. I talked to Dan about it, and he was supportive, as always. Whatever you decide, it's okay, he told me. You don't have to rush into anything. And he was right. I didn't have to make a decision right away. I could take my time, but eventually, I knew I would have to face it. So, after thinking it over for what felt like forever, I messaged her back. Yeah, I think I'm ready to meet. She responded almost immediately, and we made plans to meet at a cafe in the city. The day of the meeting, I was a nervous wreck. I must have changed outfits 3 times before finally settling on something casual. I didn't want to overthink it, but how could I not? When I got to the cafe, she was already there, sitting at a table by the window. She looked exactly like the pictures she had sent me, but seeing her in person was different. She looked nervous too, fidgeting with her hands and glancing at the door every few seconds. I took a deep breath and walked over. When she saw me, she smiled, a small, tentative smile, and stood up. Hi, I said, my voice shaky. Hi, she replied. It's really good to finally see you. I sat down, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. It was awkward, sure, but there was also something comforting about it. We didn't have to say much. We both knew how much this moment meant. And as we sat there talking about everything and nothing, I realized that no matter what happened next, I wasn't alone in this. I had my birth mother, I had my adoptive parents, and I had Dan. My family might not look the way I thought it did, but it was still my family, and that was enough.